Everything was going smoothly, until it wasn't. A black Navy veteran calmly sitting in his seat suddenly finds himself kicked off a flight for no reason. But what happened next shocked everyone. In just 6 minutes, he turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. What did he do that brought an entire airline to its knees? Stick around, because the answer will leave you questioning everything. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more. The plane was almost ready to take off. Greg Williams, a 38-year-old veteran of the United States Navy, had just settled into his seat. He was returning from a well-deserved vacation and was looking forward to the smooth flight ahead. The flight was packed, but Greg had the luxury of a first-class seat, something he'd earned after years of hard work and service. He was no stranger to flying, especially after his time in the military, where he had traveled all over the world. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening at first, and he had no reason to expect what was about to unfold. But then, just as the flight attendant walked down the aisle, everything changed. She stopped at Greg's seat and looked at the boarding pass in his hand. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the ticket and then back at Greg. There was a slight pause, and Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She asked him to move to another seat. Greg, taken aback, calmly explained that his ticket clearly indicated that this was his seat in first class. He even pointed to the seat number on the ticket to show her that everything was in order. However, the flight attendant didn't seem to care. She insisted that Greg was in the wrong seat and needed to move. Confused but still composed, Greg refused, telling her again that his seat was indeed where he was sitting. But the more he explained, the more agitated the attendant seemed to become. Greg couldn't understand why this was happening. He was just trying to enjoy his flight home. But then, as if things weren't escalating enough, a supervisor was called to handle the situation. And that's when it all started to spiral out of control. The supervisor arrived quickly, and instead of resolving the issue, he sided with the flight attendant, ordering Greg to move. His patience was wearing thin, and the passengers around him began to notice the growing tension. The supervisor then began to get more forceful, and in a matter of minutes, Greg was asked to leave the plane. The entire situation, which had started with a simple misunderstanding, was turning into something much darker. Greg couldn't believe what was happening. He had served his country, fought for his country, and now he was being treated like this, forced off a plane for no reason other than a misunderstanding. The humiliation was unbearable, and as Greg stepped off the plane, he knew that this wasn't just about him. Something bigger was at play here. As Greg stood there, his mind was racing. How had things escalated so quickly? He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some with concern, others with confusion. He wasn't just being escorted off the plane, he was being humiliated in front of a full flight. He had heard stories of mistreatment before, but he never imagined it would happen to him, especially not after everything he had done for his country. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about a mix-up over seats. This was about respect, or the lack of it. But what really struck him in that moment was how easily the airline had dismissed him, as if his word didn't matter. The fact that he was a veteran seemed to hold no weight at all. He'd fought in combat zones, survived the most dangerous situations, and now he was being treated like an outsider on his own flight. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but his frustration was growing. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He couldn't, not after everything he had sacrificed. As Greg was escorted back through the terminal, his mind kept running through the details. Why had the flight attendant treated him like that? Was it because of the way he looked? Was there some kind of racial bias involved? He couldn't help but wonder. But even more than that, he was thinking about what he could do next. This couldn't just end here. The more he thought about the situation, the more determined he became to make sure the airline knew they couldn't just treat people like this. He was about to do something that would shake the airline to its core, something they would never forget. As he stood there, waiting for his luggage to be returned to him, a strange calm settled over him. He had been pushed too far, and now he was going to make them pay attention. He wasn't sure what his next move would be, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Greg didn't have to wait long before the opportunity presented itself. He had been standing near the gate, still in shock, when he noticed one of the airline's customer service representatives walking by. The rep had a clipboard in hand, looking around at the scattered passengers, trying to manage the growing chaos. Without thinking, Greg stepped forward. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't just walk away quietly. He had to make his voice heard. "Excuse me," Greg called out, his voice steady but firm. The rep turned, a look of mild annoyance on her face at being interrupted. But when she saw the frustration in Greg's eyes, she hesitated. "I need to speak to someone about what just happened. I was just kicked off my flight for no reason, and I demand an explanation." The rep seemed taken aback, clearly not expecting to be confronted. She glanced at the clipboard in her hand, trying to avoid eye contact, but Greg wasn't backing down. "I've been on flights all over the world, and I've never been treated like this," he continued. "I served my country for years, and now I'm being thrown off a plane like I'm some kind of criminal. You're telling me that this is how your airline treats veterans?" The customer service rep shifted uncomfortably, clearly not equipped to deal with this level of confrontation. She mumbled something about a misunderstanding, and that the staff were just following protocol. But Greg wasn't buying it. He knew this wasn't just a simple mistake. It was bigger than that. He could feel the frustration bubbling up inside him again, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to make sure his voice was heard, and he needed to be strategic about how he went about it. That's when it hit him. He wasn't just dealing with a rogue flight attendant or a misunderstanding. He was dealing with an entire system that had failed him. This wasn't just about his seat being taken away or being humiliated in front of strangers. This was about a much deeper problem. How people, especially veterans, were being treated in this country. Greg wasn't just going to walk away quietly and let it slide. He was going to make sure that this injustice didn't go unnoticed. Without another word, Greg pulled out his phone and dialed the number for corporate customer service. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't going to just let this go. If the airline wasn't going to listen to him in person, he would take it to the next level. He wasn't asking for an apology. He was demanding accountability. He wasn't just a passenger, he was a person with rights, and if they weren't going to respect those rights, he'd make sure everyone knew about it. And that was exactly what he did next. As the phone rang, Greg could feel his heart racing. He was frustrated, angry, and still reeling from what had just happened. But he was determined. He needed to make sure this went beyond just one bad flight. He needed to expose the system that allowed this kind of treatment to happen. When someone finally picked up on the other end, Greg didn't waste any time. "I was just removed from your flight for no reason. I'm a Navy veteran, and I was treated like I didn't matter," Greg said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I want to speak to someone higher up, someone who can actually do something about this." The person on the other end, sounding taken aback by Greg's firm tone, apologized and asked for the details. Greg explained everything: the mix-up with the seat, the flight attendant's refusal to listen, and how he was unceremoniously escorted off the plane like he was a troublemaker. He made it clear that he wasn't looking for empty apologies. He wanted accountability. "Look, this isn't just about me," Greg said, now growing more confident in his stance. "This is about how your airline treats its passengers, especially veterans. It's about respect, and right now, I'm not feeling any of it." He could hear the person on the other end scribbling notes, but Greg wasn't ready to let up just yet. He wanted to make sure his voice was not only heard, but that it would be impossible to ignore. "I demand that this incident be escalated. You need to make sure that the people involved, those flight attendants, the supervisor, understand the gravity of what they've done. They can't just go around treating people like this without consequences." The representative told him that someone would follow up with him soon, but Greg wasn't convinced. He'd heard that line before. He needed more than just a vague promise of a follow-up. He needed action. He wasn't going to let this incident get swept under the rug, and as much as he was angry, there was a quiet determination in him now. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a person who had earned the right to be treated with respect. After ending the call, Greg stood there for a moment, thinking about his next steps. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The airline had clearly underestimated how far he would go. But Greg wasn't some random passenger who would just forget about the way he'd been treated. He had the tools, the connections, and the courage to take this fight all the way to the top. The airline would have no choice but to listen. He took a deep breath, knowing that this wasn't just about one flight or one bad experience. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through what he had just experienced. And as he looked around the terminal, he knew it wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. Greg knew the phone call wouldn't be enough. If he wanted to make sure this didn't get buried, he needed to take his message further, where it couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just going to sit back and let this pass as an isolated incident. The anger that had built up inside him started to focus into something more strategic. He remembered something he had learned during his time in the Navy. When you're facing a problem, you don't just react, you plan. That's when Greg decided to use the most powerful tool he had, social media. In a matter of minutes, he typed out a detailed post on his Twitter account. He explained everything, how he had been wrongfully kicked off the flight, the disrespect he had faced from the staff, and how, as a veteran, he felt his rights were violated. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he recounted the events, each word building his case and demanding accountability. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a call for action. He wasn't just venting his frustration, he was using his story to make a statement. Greg didn't just write about his own experience, he urged others to share their stories too. He included a hashtag, #RespectVeterans. His post was honest, straightforward, and powerful. He wanted to ensure that people understood this wasn't just one bad encounter. It was part of a larger problem. Within minutes, his tweet was gaining traction. People began commenting, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. Some were veterans. Others were just regular passengers who had faced similar disrespect. The hashtag quickly went viral. But it wasn't just the response from everyday people that fueled his fire. There was one reply that caught his eye. A tweet from an influential journalist who had a large following. The journalist's tweet acknowledged Greg's experience and promised to look into the issue further. That was the turning point. With a simple retweet, Greg knew the story would spread like wildfire. The airline could no longer pretend this was a small, isolated issue. It was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare, and Greg was right at the center of it. The more Greg thought about it, the more he realized the power of social media. In just a few hours, he had turned what seemed like an embarrassing personal experience into a movement. People were speaking up, sharing their own stories, and demanding change. The airline's social media accounts started to fill with angry comments, many from people who had never even flown with them before. They didn't just care about what happened to Greg. They cared about the larger issue of how veterans, and everyone, deserved to be treated with respect. Greg's phone buzzed constantly now, both with notifications and messages of support. Some were from old military friends, others from complete strangers who wanted to thank him for speaking up. He could feel the weight of it all, the pressure on the airline to do something, the people rallying behind him, and the knowledge that this wasn't going to be over anytime soon. The airline couldn't pretend this wasn't a problem anymore. It had gone from a simple customer complaint to a full-blown social media crisis, and Greg was right at the heart of it, ready to take the next step. As the hours passed, Greg's phone didn't stop buzzing. His post had spread far beyond what he had expected. Messages were flooding in from all over the country. Veterans, airline passengers, even people who had never set foot on an airplane were reaching out to show their support. But it wasn't just words of encouragement that kept coming through. Greg was receiving offers from media outlets, eager to hear his side of the story. This wasn't just about a bad flight anymore. It had become a full-fledged public issue. By the time the next morning rolled around, Greg had no idea just how much his actions were going to ripple through the system. His post had gained so much attention that major news outlets were covering it. He had become the face of a movement, one that demanded better treatment for veterans, better accountability from airlines, and a reckoning with the way people of color were often treated in spaces where they were supposed to feel safe and respected. He woke up to a news alert on his phone. The story had been picked up by a national news network. They were airing it as a breaking news segment, with Greg's tweet front and center. The headline was blunt: "Veteran removed from flight over seat dispute, sparks national outcry." There was his face now plastered all over social media and news websites. His story wasn't just about a bad airline experience. It was a public reckoning, a spotlight on how quickly things could spiral into disrespect and dehumanization, especially for veterans and people of color. Greg wasn't sure how he felt about becoming the center of this media storm. At first, he had just wanted to be heard, to make sure his experience was taken seriously. But now it was bigger than he ever could have imagined. As he sat in his apartment, his phone constantly buzzing with calls, texts, and emails, he started to feel a heavy weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for all the people who had ever been mistreated, who had ever been overlooked or pushed aside. The pressure was on. A few hours later, a representative from the airline finally called him. It was the first real outreach he had received from them, and they sounded desperate. They apologized for the incident and tried to downplay the severity of the situation, but Greg wasn't interested in their scripted apology. He didn't want to hear excuses, he wanted action. They offered him compensation, miles, vouchers, a free flight, anything to make the situation go away. But Greg wasn't swayed by empty gestures. He wasn't just looking for a free ride, he was looking for accountability. He told them, point blank, that compensation wasn't enough. He wanted to know what the airline was going to do about the employees involved, and how they were going to ensure something like this never happened again. The representative promised that they would look into it and get back to him. But Greg knew that it was just a tactic to buy time, hoping the storm would blow over. But Greg wasn't going to let that happen. He knew that if he let them off the hook now, it would be the same as letting it all slide. He wasn't going to be a footnote in a corporate apology. He was going to keep pushing until the issue was addressed at its core. As he hung up, Greg felt a mix of emotions. He had made his point, but the fight was far from over. The airline might have been scrambling to save face, but he knew they hadn't learned their lesson yet. Greg had already proven that he could disrupt the system. Now, it was time to turn the pressure up even higher. He started drafting emails to journalists, organizing interviews, and even coordinating with the veteran advocacy groups that had reached out to him. This wasn't just about his seat on a plane anymore. It was about exposing a culture of complacency and bias that affected far too many people. The more Greg thought about it, the clearer it became. He wasn't going to stop until the airline not only took responsibility, but made real, lasting changes. This wasn't a fight he was going to win quickly, but it was one he was determined to win. And as he prepared to speak with more media outlets that afternoon, he knew this was just the beginning. The real change was about to happen. By the time Greg finished his interviews with the media, it felt like the entire nation was paying attention. His phone kept buzzing with new messages, some of them from journalists, others from strangers, and many from people in positions of power, all offering support or seeking his perspective. What had started as a single personal incident had turned into a national conversation. And with every interview he gave, Greg's message grew clearer. This wasn't just about his seat on an airplane. This was about a larger issue, about how people in power, whether in the airline industry or elsewhere, too often mistreat those who are vulnerable or marginalized. The attention the story was receiving was beginning to feel overwhelming, but in a way it was exactly what Greg had hoped for. He wanted the airline to feel the pressure. He wanted them to know that their actions had consequences. More importantly, he wanted to spark a change in the way passengers, especially veterans, were treated. Greg knew he couldn't do this alone, but the response from the public was making it clear that he didn't have to. While Greg spoke with reporters, his post on social media continued to gain traction. The hashtag #RespectVeterans was now being used in thousands of posts. People shared their own stories of mistreatment, not just by airlines, but by other institutions, whether it was stores, schools, or even hospitals. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just one bad airline incident. It was part of a much bigger issue. Veterans, people of color, and everyday individuals were all chiming in with stories of injustice, discrimination, and being treated as if they didn't matter. Greg's story had ignited something, a fire that couldn't be put out. It wasn't just the general public reacting anymore. Political leaders, too, began weighing in. Several prominent senators and congresspeople expressed their outrage, some even calling for hearings on the treatment of veterans and how airlines handle complaints. Greg couldn't believe the weight of it all. He had started out just wanting to stand up for himself, but now, his story was forcing a nationwide conversation about systemic issues within the travel industry. Every day, more people were coming forward, demanding accountability, demanding better treatment for all passengers, but especially for those who had served the country. By the end of the week, the pressure on the airline was palpable. It was clear that they were trying to manage the crisis, but every attempt to downplay the situation only seemed to make it worse. Their social media posts apologizing for the incident were being drowned out by a wave of angry comments from the public. The company had initially tried to offer Greg compensation, a voucher, miles, and a promise of a better experience on another flight, but he had refused. He wasn't interested in free perks. He wanted them to address the core issue, to address how veterans were often treated, especially when they weren't in uniform. It was clear now that Greg wasn't backing down, and the more the airline tried to sweep it under the rug, the more the public demanded they take real action. It wasn't long before the airline's CEO issued a public statement. The statement was well crafted, expressing regret over the incident and promising to investigate. But for Greg, it wasn't enough. He had heard corporate apologies before, and they were often empty. This time, though, he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't just looking for a statement. He wanted change. Real change. Greg knew that the airline would be forced to do more than issue a half-hearted apology. The public pressure, the political pressure, and the attention from the media had made it clear that they couldn't just offer a few miles and call it a day. Something had to shift. Greg's fight was gaining momentum. What began as one man standing up for his rights had now grown into something bigger. A fight for respect, accountability, and a rethinking of how people are treated in public spaces. And Greg wasn't about to let it stop here. In the days that followed, Greg began to see the impact of his actions. Other veterans started reaching out to him, thanking him for raising awareness about the issues they faced every day. People who had been afraid to speak up now felt empowered to share their own stories. It was as though Greg's single act of standing up for himself had triggered a wave of people finally speaking out against the injustices they had endured. The fight for veterans' rights was no longer just a personal battle. It was a movement. And Greg was at the center of it all. But he wasn't done yet. He knew that he had to keep the pressure on. Greg wasn't looking for the spotlight. He was looking for change. It was clear that the airline and many other institutions had overlooked a significant issue for far too long. And now, with the whole country watching, Greg was ready to make sure they couldn't ignore it any longer. The real work was just beginning, and Greg was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. As the days passed, Greg's resolve only grew stronger. The public outcry, the media coverage, and the massive support he was receiving from veterans and everyday citizens alike kept him focused. But even with all this momentum, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The airline had apologized, but that wasn't enough. They had issued a public statement, but words were meaningless without action. Greg wasn't interested in empty promises or token gestures. What he wanted was real change, not just for him, but for every person who had been treated unfairly or discriminated against in public spaces. The spotlight was now on the airline, but Greg knew it wouldn't last forever. He had to make sure they couldn't just wait out the storm. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, Greg received an unexpected call. It was a high-level representative from the airline's legal department. The representative introduced themselves and immediately launched into an apology, which Greg had heard 1,000 times by now. But this time, it was different. The tone was more serious. "Mr. Williams, we've reviewed the situation thoroughly, and we take full responsibility for the incident. However, we would like to discuss how we can resolve this matter privately," the representative said. Greg wasn't sure what they meant by resolving this privately, but he had an idea. They were probably trying to offer him some kind of compensation again. Miles, free flights, maybe even a public apology. But Greg was done with that. He wasn't interested in a quick fix. He'd made it clear from the start that he wasn't looking for a free ride or an empty apology. He wanted more. "I'm not interested in compensation or free flights," Greg replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm interested in real change. If you want to resolve this, I want a meeting with someone at the highest level, someone who can guarantee that this kind of thing won't happen again." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as if the representative wasn't sure how to respond. "I understand, Mr. Williams. Let me see what I can do," they said before hanging up. Greg sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had just taken a significant step. It wasn't enough to let them throw money at the situation or offer him a token gesture. He needed them to understand the gravity of the issue. He wasn't just going to let them sweep this under the rug, and now they were realizing that. They had to face the consequences. The days that followed were a blur. Greg spent most of his time speaking with veteran advocacy groups, organizing meetings, and strategizing his next move. He began to make connections with people in higher circles, people who had the power to force real change. Some were former military officers, others were civil rights activists, but they all shared one thing in common. They were all ready to stand with Greg and help push for the changes that were desperately needed. Greg's story was no longer just his own. It had become a rallying cry for people who had been marginalized, mistreated, or silenced. And now together, they were going to make sure the airline, and every other corporation, heard them loud and clear. At the same time, the media continued to cover the story. But now the coverage was no longer just about Greg's experience on the plane. It had become about how this incident had exposed deeper issues within the airline industry and beyond. Articles were being written about how veterans, especially veterans of color, were often treated unfairly by corporations. Public figures began to speak out, calling for a change in policies not just at the airline, but across the entire travel industry. The spotlight was no longer just on Greg. It was on an entire system that had been allowed to perpetuate discrimination and mistreatment without consequence. Then the call came. The airline had agreed to a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with the CEO. Greg was going to sit down with the top decision-maker of one of the largest airlines in the world. He could hardly believe it. This was the moment he had been working toward. It wasn't just a chance to have his voice heard. It was a chance to make a real, lasting impact. If he could get the airline to commit to real change, it would set a precedent for other companies to follow. This was his opportunity to force their hand, to make sure they understood that this wasn't just about one bad flight. It was about changing the way people, especially veterans and people of color, were treated across the board. As he prepared for the meeting, Greg couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Just a few weeks ago, he had been a regular passenger on a flight, quietly enjoying his trip. Now he was sitting on the precipice of something much bigger, a movement that could change the way people thought about respect, fairness, and accountability. It had all started with one simple act of standing up for himself, but now it was a fight for something much larger. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. The airline wasn't going to just roll over. But Greg was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had. And as he prepared to walk into that meeting, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The day of the meeting arrived, and Greg felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that he couldn't shake. He had spoken with many people in the days leading up to it, from veterans organizations to journalists, even political figures who had joined his cause. Now, all of that was leading to this one crucial moment. The CEO of the airline had agreed to meet with him, and Greg knew this was his opportunity to press for the kind of real change he had been fighting for. As Greg walked into the airline's corporate headquarters, a tall, modern building that screamed business as usual, he couldn't help but feel a sense of surrealism. A few weeks ago, he had been just another passenger, one among many, quietly sitting in his seat. Now he was stepping into the heart of one of the world's largest airlines, ready to challenge them at their highest level. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The room where he was to meet the CEO was sleek and impersonal. Glass walls, polished floors, minimalistic furniture. There was no warmth in the space, just a cold corporate professionalism that seemed to reflect everything wrong with the airline industry. A few minutes passed before the CEO entered the room, a middle-aged man in a dark suit with a confident, almost detached demeanor. He greeted Greg with a firm handshake but didn't waste time with pleasantries. The tension in the room was palpable. "Mr. Williams," the CEO began, settling into the chair across from Greg, "I understand you've made quite a public issue out of an incident that occurred on one of our flights. We've reviewed the details, and we're here to discuss how we can resolve this matter." Greg remained calm, but inside his heart was pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything he'd worked for could either succeed or fail. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he spoke. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. But let's be clear. I'm not here for compensation or an empty apology. This isn't about me, and it never was. It's about something much bigger, how veterans, especially black veterans, are treated. It's about respect. The kind of respect that I, and others like me, earned and deserve." The CEO, looking a bit taken aback by the bluntness of Greg's words, adjusted in his seat. "We're sorry that you felt disrespected, Mr. Williams. We've already taken action internally. The employees involved have been disciplined, and we're reviewing our training protocols to make sure this doesn't happen again." Greg's eyes narrowed. He had heard that line before, action behind closed doors, but he wasn't convinced it would amount to anything substantial. He knew that if they wanted to move past this, they had to do more than just talk. They had to show the public that they were serious about changing how they treated passengers, particularly veterans. "I don't want your corporate jargon," Greg said, his voice firm. "I want transparency. I want you to prove that you're not just paying lip service to this. You're not just sweeping it under the rug. If the treatment of veterans and people of color is going to change, then it starts with you. Right here, right now." There was a long silence. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not used to being confronted so directly. Greg could tell that he was weighing his options, perhaps considering how best to manage the public relations nightmare this was turning into. The meeting wasn't just about him. It was about making sure that the airline understood they couldn't continue to operate as they always had. The world was watching now, and Greg wasn't going to let them pretend this issue didn't exist. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the CEO spoke again, but this time his tone was different, less defensive, more measured. "You're right, Mr. Williams. We've made mistakes, and we can't fix those mistakes by just issuing statements or internal memos. If we want to regain the trust of passengers, we need to do more. We need to show the world that we understand the gravity of the situation." Greg nodded, not fully convinced, but at least hearing something that resembled accountability. The conversation shifted as the CEO began to outline the airline's plan to address the situation: new training programs, a review of their hiring practices, and a commitment to diversity and inclusion in a way that would go beyond surface-level changes. But Greg wasn't letting them off the hook just yet. "This is a start," Greg said slowly, "but it's not enough. I need you to take action that goes beyond internal memos and vague promises. I want to see you publicly commit to real change. I want to see this issue addressed in your marketing, in your employee training, and in your public communications. And it can't just be a one-time thing. This needs to be part of your company's DNA moving forward." The CEO paused, clearly uncomfortable with the level of scrutiny Greg was putting on him. But Greg knew that was the point. The more uncomfortable he made them feel, the more they'd be pushed into making a meaningful commitment. Greg had been pushed to the edge on that flight. Now he was pushing the airline right back. After a tense pause, the CEO finally nodded. "You're right. We can do better, and we will. I will personally oversee a committee that will work on these changes, and we will make them public. I'll also ensure that we partner with veteran organizations to make sure our actions match our words." Greg could feel the smallest flicker of satisfaction in that moment. This wasn't the victory he had imagined when he first boarded that flight, but it was a victory nonetheless. The airline was listening now, and they were starting to realize that their actions and their inaction had consequences. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about holding institutions accountable for the way they treated people. As Greg stood to leave the meeting, he knew it wasn't over. The airline might have agreed to take action, but this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Greg wasn't going to stop until he saw those changes in motion, until he saw a system that truly respected veterans, people of color, and every passenger who stepped foot on their planes. But for now, he had made a dent. He had forced the airline to confront the issues they had long ignored. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, Greg felt like he was on the path to real change. This was just the first battle in a much bigger war. In the days that followed the meeting with the CEO, Greg could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders grow heavier. The words exchanged in that sleek corporate boardroom, while significant, were only the first step in a much longer journey. The airline's commitment to do better and implement changes sounded promising, but Greg knew better than to trust words alone. He had seen too many companies issue public apologies only to revert to business as usual once the cameras were off. This time, Greg wasn't going to let that happen. The very next morning, Greg put his thoughts into action. He called the media, making sure that the story continued to stay in the public eye. He spoke to reporters who had been covering the incident, sharing the details of the meeting with the CEO, and emphasizing that the fight was far from over. He made it clear that this wasn't about one bad incident. It was about a systemic issue that had been ignored for far too long. Greg wasn't just a voice of one man. He was the voice of a community that had been overlooked, mistreated, and disrespected for years. But it wasn't just the media that Greg turned to. He knew that he needed to keep the pressure on the airline, and the best way to do that was by staying organized and relentless. He began to work with veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and other activists to build a coalition that could hold the airline accountable. Together, they drafted a petition that called for concrete actions that went beyond the CEO's vague promises. They demanded that the airline create an independent oversight committee to monitor how they handled complaints related to discrimination and unfair treatment. They also called for public transparency, asking for quarterly reports detailing the progress of the changes the airline promised to implement. But perhaps most importantly, they demanded that the airline make a formal apology to Greg and to all veterans who had been wronged, a gesture that went beyond a private conversation or a social media post. Greg didn't stop there. He knew that corporate promises could be easily forgotten without the right kind of pressure. He reached out to lawmakers who had spoken out in his support, encouraging them to take the matter up in public hearings. The issue wasn't just about one airline's mistakes. It was about how the entire industry treated veterans and marginalized groups. Greg's push for a congressional hearing aimed to bring attention to the broader cultural problems within the airline industry. He wasn't looking to single out one airline. He was looking to change the whole system. If the airline industry could be forced to reckon with the way it treated its most vulnerable passengers, perhaps that would have a ripple effect across other industries as well. Greg also took the time to personally engage with his growing network of supporters. He spent hours on the phone, responding to messages from veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been following his story. His inbox was flooded with personal stories of discrimination and mistreatment, each one a reminder that his fight was bigger than himself. As he read through the messages, Greg realized just how much of a difference he had already made. People who had felt powerless for years were now emboldened to speak out. What had started as a fight to correct one injustice was now a movement to hold institutions accountable for their treatment of veterans, minorities, and every passenger who had been treated as less than human. Despite all the momentum, Greg couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenge ahead. The airline, though publicly committed to change, was not going to roll over easily. Greg had already seen their tactics. They had tried to smooth things over with compensation offers, with corporate statements, and with vague promises. But the public scrutiny wasn't going away, and neither was Greg. He was pushing harder, and every step he took was met with resistance. The airline's legal department began to push back, trying to slow down the petition, questioning the demands for oversight, and offering counter-proposals. They even suggested that Greg and his coalition were making unreasonable demands, trying to paint them as people who just wanted to keep the issue alive for personal gain. But Greg wasn't deterred. If anything, the more the airline fought back, the more determined he became. He knew that if they were pushing back this hard, it meant they were feeling the pressure. And that was exactly what he wanted. The louder his voice grew, the more attention the issue received, and the more it became impossible for the airline or any other corporation to ignore it. In the midst of this, Greg began to notice something that fueled his drive even further. The public was starting to pick sides. The hashtag #RespectVeterans had exploded on social media, and it wasn't just veterans using it anymore. Ordinary citizens were rallying behind Greg, expressing solidarity with the cause. People were sharing their own stories of being mistreated, and the online movement was growing by the day. Some companies began to take notice and reached out to Greg with offers of support, expressing interest in backing his call for systemic change. This was no longer just about one airline. It was about a broader movement to hold institutions accountable for their actions and to give a voice to those who had long been ignored. Meanwhile, the airline, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, began to issue more public statements. They highlighted their ongoing review of procedures and promised to enhance customer experience going forward. But their words didn't carry the same weight they once did. People weren't fooled by vague corporate speak anymore. They wanted results, not promises. Greg knew that this battle was far from over. He had made a dent, but there was still much work to be done. The pressure on the airline was mounting, but he also knew that true, lasting change wasn't going to come overnight. He had to stay focused, stay organized, and keep pushing forward. This wasn't just about his own experience. It was about the hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people who had been silenced for too long. Greg was determined to be the voice they needed, the catalyst for the change that was so desperately overdue. As he sat at his desk, sifting through more messages and petitions, Greg looked at the road ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like he was actually making a difference. He wasn't just a man standing up for his rights anymore. He was leading a movement, one that could change the way people were treated in the public eye. And he wasn't going to stop until that change was made real. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind for Greg. He had ignited a spark, and now it was spreading faster than he could have ever anticipated. The pressure on the airline was growing, and their public relations team seemed to be scrambling to maintain control. But Greg wasn't slowing down. If anything, the momentum behind his movement was only intensifying. Every day brought new developments, new media coverage, new supporters, and new challenges. But through it all, Greg stayed focused on one thing: real change. He knew that this wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. This was about creating lasting, systemic change within an entire industry. And he wasn't going to stop until that change was a reality. Greg's phone buzzed incessantly. Some days it felt overwhelming, the constant stream of calls, messages, and emails. But he didn't let it distract him. He knew the fight ahead was bigger than any one person. The support he was receiving from veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and even everyday people who had been following the story online was overwhelming. People were reaching out from all corners of the country, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment. They wanted to join the cause, to make sure their voices were heard as well. Greg's personal story had become a symbol of something much larger. It had become a rallying cry for those who had long been ignored by institutions, for those who had been subjected to unfair treatment because of their race, their gender, or their status as veterans. As the movement grew, so did the pressure on the airline. Greg was relentless in his pursuit of accountability. He didn't just want promises, he wanted measurable actions. The petition he and his coalition had started had gained thousands of signatures. It was no longer just a document of support. It was a clear demand for change. And people weren't just signing their names. They were sharing it with their friends, their families, their social circles. The more people learned about what had happened to Greg, the more they became invested in the cause. Greg didn't shy away from the spotlight. He understood the importance of keeping the issue in front of the public. The media continued to cover the story, and Greg used every interview, every opportunity, to push for concrete changes. One of his main points was that the airline needed to do more than just change their training programs. They needed to be held accountable by a third party. The internal review process was no longer enough. It needed to be independent, transparent, and open to public scrutiny. Greg's demand for external oversight was met with resistance, but he knew it was necessary. If the airline was serious about change, they needed to prove it, not just say it. As the calls for accountability grew louder, the airline began to shift its approach. They started making more public gestures, statements from top executives, more focus on diversity and inclusion in their marketing materials, and even an apology video from the CEO. But for Greg, these were just attempts to save face. He wasn't buying it. He needed to see action. The CEO's apology, though heartfelt, felt hollow to him. Greg knew that words were easy to say. What mattered was what happened next. Greg began to ramp up his efforts. He organized town hall meetings, inviting people from all walks of life to speak about their own experiences with discrimination and mistreatment. These meetings, which were streamed online, attracted hundreds of viewers. Veterans, people of color, parents, and regular citizens, all sharing stories of how they had been wronged by corporations, the government, or society in general. The town halls were emotional, raw, and incredibly powerful. They gave people a platform to speak up, a space where they could share their experiences without fear of retribution. Greg listened attentively to every story, knowing that each one added weight to his cause. The most surprising part of the town halls was the number of people who reached out to Greg privately after the sessions. Many shared personal stories of racial bias, unfair treatment, and discrimination, and many of them were too afraid to speak out publicly. Greg realized that the movement he had started wasn't just about fighting for his own rights. It was about creating a space where others could safely share their own stories and demand justice. The more he learned about what people were going through, the more determined he became to fight not just for veterans, but for everyone who had been treated unjustly. Meanwhile, the airline was starting to feel the pressure from all sides. Politicians were getting involved, and some were even calling for a congressional investigation into the airline's practices. The public outcry was undeniable, and it was clear that the airline couldn't just keep offering half-hearted apologies and PR stunts. They had to make real changes, and they had to be seen making those changes. As Greg continued to lead the charge, the airline's legal team worked tirelessly to try to manage the fallout. They were trying to play the long game, hoping that if they waited out the storm, things would eventually calm down. But Greg wasn't about to let that happen. He knew that if they were allowed to get away with the bare minimum, this whole ordeal would have been for nothing. One afternoon, as Greg was preparing for another media appearance, he received a call from an unexpected source, the airline's chief diversity officer. She had been following the story closely and wanted to meet with Greg to discuss the next steps. The fact that they were reaching out to him directly was a sign that the pressure was starting to take its toll. She told Greg that the airline had realized they needed to do more than just make superficial changes. They needed to engage in a real dialogue with the communities they served. Greg agreed to meet, but he wasn't ready to let them off the hook. When they sat down together, he made it clear that any discussion about moving forward had to be rooted in transparency. He insisted that the airline work with independent third-party auditors to oversee the implementation of their diversity and inclusion initiatives, and that they publicly commit to publishing quarterly progress reports. Greg wasn't going to let the airline slide by with vague promises or internal reviews. He knew that if the airline was serious about changing, they needed to be held accountable not just by their internal teams, but by the people they served. As the conversation unfolded, Greg saw something in the chief diversity officer's eyes, a recognition that this wasn't just about a PR disaster for the airline. It was about doing what was right. She agreed to many of Greg's demands and promised that the airline would begin working with external auditors to ensure that their diversity programs were more than just window dressing. Greg knew this wasn't a complete victory yet, but it was progress. That night, Greg sat down to write an update for his supporters. The fight was far from over, but he was finally beginning to see the kind of change he had been pushing for. The airline had made commitments, but now it was time to hold them accountable. Greg's heart was full, but his resolve was even stronger. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the verge of something real. He wasn't just changing one airline, he was changing the way the entire industry thought about respect, equality, and accountability. And that, Greg knew, was only the beginning. The weeks following the meeting with the chief diversity officer were a pivotal time for Greg. As much as he wanted to feel the satisfaction of a small victory, he knew the hard work was far from over. The airline had made public commitments to improve, but Greg had seen enough corporate promises to know that without consistent pressure, those commitments could easily slip away. Now, it was time to hold them accountable, and to ensure that they followed through on their promises, not just for Greg, but for everyone who had been affected by similar mistreatment. Greg had become a symbol of accountability, but he also understood that one voice, no matter how loud, wasn't enough to change an entire system. He needed to keep the momentum going, and he needed a platform that would ensure the issue remained in the public eye. He turned to the one thing that had gotten him this far: the power of grassroots organizing and social media. The hashtag #RespectVeterans had become more than just a call to action. It had turned into a movement. People were sharing their stories, offering their support, and demanding change. The airline was under a microscope, and it wasn't just Greg who was watching. The public was too. As Greg continued to advocate for real, lasting change, he decided to take the next step. He and his team of supporters started organizing a rally in Washington, D.C., aimed at both raising awareness and pressuring lawmakers to take action. The rally was going to be a huge undertaking, but Greg believed it was necessary. It wasn't enough for the airline to make changes in isolation. This was about a larger issue that required systemic reform. The event would focus on a few key issues: fair treatment of veterans, racial equity, and corporate accountability in the airline industry. Greg knew that these issues couldn't be solved in isolation. They needed to be addressed as part of a broader conversation on social justice. Greg and his team worked tirelessly for weeks to organize the rally. They reached out to veteran organizations, civil rights groups, labor unions, and anyone who had a stake in fighting for equality and accountability. The response was overwhelming. People were eager to come together, to make their voices heard, and to stand in solidarity with Greg's fight. Veterans from all over the country pledged to attend, as did countless others who had been inspired by Greg's story. The rally was shaping up to be much more than just a protest. It was becoming a statement that the fight for justice was a fight that united people from all walks of life. As the date for the rally drew closer, the airline began to feel the pressure. Their PR teams had been busy, releasing more statements and holding internal meetings to discuss the best way to manage the situation. But Greg was no longer interested in their words. The time for empty apologies was long past. He had pushed the airline to make commitments, but now it was time to push them to take action. The rally would be a critical part of that effort. Greg's platform had only grown stronger, and he had the public's support on his side. He knew that if they could turn the rally into a massive show of force, it would be impossible for the airline to ignore the demands for real change. In the meantime, Greg kept up his media appearances, speaking on TV, radio, and podcasts. He talked about the importance of holding corporations accountable, about the systemic racism that so often went unchecked in industries like aviation, and about how the treatment of veterans was often overlooked. The media attention had skyrocketed since his initial social media post, and every appearance was another opportunity to bring the issue to a broader audience. The more Greg spoke, the more people were listening, not just to him, but to the message he was carrying. It wasn't just about one airline or one person's bad experience. It was about systemic inequality and the need for accountability in every institution that held power over people's lives. At the same time, the airline began to realize just how serious Greg's movement had become. They had already committed to making changes, but now they were under intense scrutiny. The rally in Washington wasn't just going to be a local event. It was going to be broadcast across the country, and perhaps even internationally. Greg had successfully turned what had started as a personal fight into a nationwide cause, and the airline knew it couldn't afford to let the situation get any worse. Behind the scenes, there were talks of more concrete changes, but Greg's team was making sure that those changes were visible, real, and publicly documented. As the day of the rally approached, Greg found himself feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. He had spent so much time speaking about change, fighting for it, and pushing for it. But now, the moment of truth was finally here. Would the rally make a real impact? Would it shift the public conversation in a way that forced the airline and other corporations to take accountability for their actions? Greg knew it was a huge risk, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He had been pushed around and disrespected for too long, and now he was ready to lead the charge for change. The night before the rally, Greg sat down in his hotel room and reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. He thought about the moment he had been kicked off that flight, how he had felt humiliated and powerless. He thought about the countless people who had come forward to share their own stories of mistreatment. And he thought about the changes he had already begun to see. The airline's public commitments, the increased awareness of veteran rights, the way the public was starting to hold corporations accountable. This rally wasn't just the culmination of his efforts. It was the next step in a much larger fight for justice and equality. The morning of the rally, Greg stood at the front of the crowd in Washington, D.C., looking out at the sea of people gathered on the National Mall. The energy was electric. Thousands of people, all united by a common cause, standing together for what was right. There were veterans in uniform, civil rights activists, families holding signs that read "Respect Veterans" and "Accountability for All." The moment was surreal. Greg had gone from being an ordinary man caught up in an unfair situation to leading a movement that had captured the nation's attention. The rally was a massive success, with speeches from veterans, lawmakers, and prominent activists. Greg spoke passionately about the importance of holding corporations accountable, about how the airline's treatment of him was just a reflection of larger societal issues, and how this moment could spark a wider conversation about respect and fairness. The rally had far-reaching media coverage, and by the time it was over, Greg had made it clear that this wasn't the end. The airline had to deliver on its promises, and if they didn't, the public would continue to hold them accountable. In the days that followed, the airline's leadership began to make good on their commitments. They announced a partnership with veteran organizations to ensure that their policies regarding the treatment of veterans were not just theoretical, but actively enforced. They established an independent oversight committee to track the progress of their diversity initiatives, and they made a public commitment to transparency, pledging to release quarterly reports on the steps they were taking to ensure fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or background. It was a hard-fought victory. Greg knew that. But it was a victory nonetheless. The airline had changed, and so had the industry. And Greg had become more than just a figurehead for his own fight. He had become the face of a movement that had shifted the conversation about equality, respect, and accountability. This was only the beginning. Months passed, and the reverberations of the rally and the ensuing changes in the airline industry continued to unfold. The attention Greg's story had garnered was no longer just a headline or a viral moment. It had sparked a transformation in how large institutions would be held accountable. What had started as a fight for his own dignity had turned into a nationwide call for justice that reached far beyond the airline industry. And while Greg could have easily walked away, basking in the success of the changes he had helped bring about, he knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than himself. The airline, despite the intense pressure they had faced, began implementing the reforms they had promised. The independent oversight committee Greg had fought for was up and running, with regular reports being published that tracked the airline's progress on diversity and inclusion. New mandatory training programs for staff had been rolled out, focusing on how to handle conflicts, ensure fairness, and respect passengers from all walks of life. They also started actively partnering with veteran organizations to ensure that military veterans were treated with the respect they deserved, not just in their advertising, but in every aspect of the customer experience. Greg had pushed for accountability, and for the first time, the airline was being forced to act on its words. But Greg didn't stop there. He began to turn his attention to the broader fight. The success with the airline was just one victory in what he saw as a much larger battle, one that would span industries and aim to address systemic inequalities that went far beyond the airline industry. Greg became a voice for veterans, for marginalized communities, and for those who had been silenced by the powerful systems that shaped their lives. He knew that if he stopped now, the changes he had helped create could be undone just as quickly as they had been won. There was still so much work to be done. In the months that followed, Greg traveled across the country, meeting with veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and lawmakers who were eager to hear his story. His voice became a rallying cry for reform, for fairness, and for the kind of systemic change that would ensure that what had happened to him on that flight would never happen to anyone else again. He was invited to speak at conferences, appeared on television and in podcasts, and even testified before Congress, advocating for veterans' rights, greater transparency in the corporate world, and stronger protections against discrimination. Greg wasn't just a voice for the voiceless. He was becoming a leader in a movement that aimed to break down the barriers of inequality that had held too many people back for too long. But despite all the success, there were challenges that Greg faced, some of them unexpected. While the airline had made strides in implementing their diversity initiatives, there were still voices that resisted these changes. Some argued that the reforms were unnecessary, that the airline was just caving to public pressure. Greg had anticipated this kind of pushback, but it still stung. The reality was, change was hard, and it would take more than just one success story to convince everyone that real reform was necessary. But Greg remained undeterred. He knew that change often came slowly, and that the most difficult fights were the ones that mattered the most. He was prepared to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles in his way. One of the most powerful moments in Greg's journey came when he received a letter from the flight attendant, who had initially removed him from the plane. She had followed the story and over time had come to realize the gravity of what had happened. In her letter, she expressed her regret for how she had treated Greg and acknowledged the systemic issues that had contributed to the incident. She apologized, and while the apology was far from easy for Greg to accept, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability, not just from corporations but from individuals who had been complicit in upholding systems of injustice. This letter, though it didn't undo the pain Greg had felt, became a turning point for him. He realized that even the smallest acts of accountability, whether from a company, a person, or a community, could have a lasting impact. The apology, he realized, was a recognition that people could change, that they could learn from their mistakes, and that change didn't always have to come from the top down. It could come from the bottom up, from the collective push of people working together to create a fairer, more just world. Greg continued to work with the airline, not only as a critic but as a partner in helping them develop the kind of long-term strategies that would help ensure the positive changes continued. He met with their leadership regularly, sitting down with the diversity and inclusion teams, helping them to understand the real-world impact of their policies. He didn't just want the airline to do the right thing. He wanted them to do it because they understood why it mattered, because they realized that true change required understanding and empathy, not just statistics or press releases. One of the most rewarding outcomes of Greg's fight was the ripple effect it created. Other industries started taking note of the changes in the airline. There were calls for increased diversity and inclusion within other sectors of transportation, in hotels, and in large retail corporations. Businesses that had previously operated with little oversight now found themselves under scrutiny, being held to a higher standard of fairness and transparency. Greg's story had become a blueprint for holding corporations accountable, not through force, but through collective action and the power of a community that refused to stay silent. But even as the movement gained traction, Greg remained grounded. He never lost sight of the personal fight that had started it all. The feeling of being humiliated and powerless, the anger at being dismissed because of who he was. That was still a part of him, but it was no longer the focus. Now he was working not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered silently, for all the passengers who had been mistreated, for all the veterans who had been ignored. The fight had become bigger than any one person, and Greg had become a leader in a movement that would outlast him. In the end, Greg had done more than change an airline's policies. He had changed the way people thought about fairness, accountability, and respect. He had forced a giant to confront its failures, and in doing so, had helped push an entire industry toward a future where everyone could be treated with dignity and respect. It was a hard-fought victory, one that took every ounce of courage he had, but Greg knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And as he looked toward the future, he knew the fight for justice, respect, and equality would continue. One step, one story, and one victory at a time. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.